At a bustling airport, the atmosphere suddenly shifts when a flight attendant, Sarah Brooks, slaps a 90-year-old woman, Margaret King, who is traveling alone with a cane. Despite the shocking act, Margaret remains remarkably calm and unshaken, not letting the incident disturb her peace. The surrounding passengers watch in stunned silence, unsure of how to react to the situation, as Sarah walks away, unaware of the gravity of her actions. Margaret, however, remains composed, poised, and dignified in the face of the confrontation. Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. If this story made you reflect, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more powerful content. Margaret King, still calm despite the shock of being slapped, looks up at Sarah Brooks with unwavering composure. As Sarah turns to walk away, Margaret speaks in a voice that carries a quiet authority. You just made the worst mistake of your life, she warns, her tone icy yet controlled. The words, though simple, hang in the air, leaving a lingering tension in the otherwise quiet terminal. Sarah stops briefly, but Margaret's steady gaze and calm demeanor leave her with a sense of unease. Around them, the other passengers stand frozen, uncertain of what to do. Some exchange wary glances, while others look away, not wanting to get involved. Margaret's unshaken presence contrasts sharply with Sarah's earlier impatience. It's clear that Margaret isn't someone easily intimidated or rattled, even by such a public confrontation. Sarah, on the other hand, appears to be rattled for the first time, unsure of how to proceed with the situation she has just escalated. Despite her warning, Margaret remains composed, sitting quietly in her seat as though nothing extraordinary has happened. The atmosphere in the airport remains tense, as everyone now wonders what will happen next. Margaret King, despite her calm and dignified reaction to the slap, seems to disappear into the background of the busy airport. In her navy blue dress, she blends in with the crowd, an elderly woman in her 90s quietly waiting in the lounge. She watches the planes take off from the window with a serene expression, seemingly unaware of the many eyes that may be upon her now. Most passengers around her continue with their own activities, either checking their phones, reading, or chatting with companions. None pay her much attention, until her warning to Sarah Brooks lingers in their minds, and they begin to wonder about the elderly woman's true identity. To most, Margaret remains just another unassuming traveler, but her composed silence holds an air of quiet authority. She doesn't draw attention to herself, but there is something commanding in her presence. Her peaceful demeanor contrasts sharply with the earlier confrontation, and some passengers begin to feel a subtle sense of respect for her, even without knowing why. Margaret's unassuming presence only deepens the mystery of who she truly is. Little do they know, her true influence has yet to be revealed. Sarah Brooks, an experienced flight attendant, walks down the terminal with a clipboard in hand, checking the boarding lines for any last-minute adjustments. As she approaches the first-class line, she spots Margaret King standing there, waiting quietly, her cane resting beside her. Sarah, in her usual routine, begins to scan the passengers, ensuring everything is in order. Her gaze briefly lands on Margaret, who doesn't appear to belong in the first-class line, at least not to Sarah's quick judgment. Without pausing to truly observe, Sarah glances at Margaret's boarding pass. She doesn't bother checking the details carefully and quickly dismisses Margaret as someone who simply doesn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger. In Sarah's mind, an elderly woman like Margaret couldn't possibly belong in the premium seating area. After all, Margaret's calm and unassuming appearance didn't fit the typical first-class traveler. Without a second thought, Sarah approaches Margaret and tells her to step aside. This is the first-class line. You need to wait in the regular line, she orders, assuming that Margaret had somehow mistakenly found herself in the wrong queue. Sarah doesn't expect any resistance, expecting Margaret to quietly comply without question. But Margaret doesn't move. She stands her ground, calmly stating that her seat is indeed in first class. Sarah, growing increasingly impatient with what she believes is a simple misunderstanding, begins to question Margaret's boarding pass. In her mind, Margaret must be trying to sneak into a class she doesn't belong to. What Sarah doesn't know is that she has just made a serious misjudgment. The situation at the airport escalates quickly as Sarah Brooks, frustrated with Margaret King's refusal to step aside, grows impatient. Margaret, still standing firm and calm, insists that she is indeed in the correct line. She pulls out her boarding pass, showing Sarah the details of her first-class ticket. But Sarah, now irritated by what she perceives as an act of defiance, dismisses Margaret's explanation with a wave of her hand. "You don't belong in this line," Sarah says firmly, her voice sharp. "Step aside, now." The tension between the two women builds as Margaret remains composed, unwilling to let herself be intimidated. "I am in the right place," Margaret calmly responds, her voice unwavering. The other passengers nearby start to take notice, and the once quiet terminal becomes filled with an uncomfortable energy. Some passengers exchange uneasy glances, while others watch the confrontation unfold in stunned silence. Sarah, her patience worn thin, repeats her demand for Margaret to move. "I don't have time for this," she mutters under her breath. She pushes Margaret aside, trying to move her out of the line. But Margaret does not budge, her cane now firmly planted on the ground as she holds her ground. At this moment, Sarah's frustration reaches a boiling point. In a rash, impulsive decision, she slaps Margaret's hand away. The sharp sound of the slap echoes in the quiet airport, causing a stunned silence to fall over the area. Margaret's cane falls to the floor with a loud clatter, drawing even more attention to the unfolding scene. The passengers nearby gasp, some visibly shocked by the audacity of the flight attendant's action. Margaret, however, doesn't flinch. Her hand, now lightly reddened from the slap, slowly retreats back to her side, and her expression remains calm and controlled. Sarah, realizing what she has just done, freezes for a moment. She looks around the terminal, suddenly aware of the eyes of the passengers on her. The shock of her own actions begins to sink in, and the discomfort in her body language becomes obvious. She expected a much different outcome, a swift compliance, perhaps, or even a quick apology from Margaret. But instead, she has set off something much bigger than she could have imagined. Margaret, her cane now on the ground, slowly bends down to retrieve it. As she rises back to her feet, she locks eyes with Sarah. There's no anger or outrage in Margaret's gaze, just a cold, unwavering authority that seems to make Sarah take a step back. "You just made the worst mistake of your life," Margaret says, her voice smooth and steady. The words are deliberate, calculated, and they carry a weight that immediately unsettles Sarah. The passengers around them continue to watch in stunned silence, some of them now whispering to each other. The sense of unease spreads like wildfire as the realization of what has just occurred begins to settle in. Sarah, her face flushed with embarrassment and fear, stands motionless as the reality of her actions begins to dawn on her. Margaret, on the other hand, remains composed, her calm demeanor giving her an air of authority that contrasts sharply with Sarah's flustered state. This moment would mark a significant turning point, but neither Sarah nor the passengers would know just how far-reaching the consequences of this encounter would become. Margaret, it seems, is no ordinary passenger, something much more profound is about to be revealed. The quiet hum of the airport resumed after the brief, tense confrontation, but the ripple effects of the altercation lingered in the air. Margaret King, having calmly picked up her cane, stood silently as Sarah Brooks, the flight attendant, was left shaken by the consequences of her rash actions. The stunned passengers who had witnessed the exchange slowly began to move, but many couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental had just taken place. Sarah, now realizing the gravity of her mistake, stood frozen. Her face flushed with embarrassment and regret. Her instincts had told her to assert her authority, but now, in the cold light of reflection, it was clear that she had misjudged the situation. Margaret, on the other hand, showed no sign of anger. She simply stood there, composed and unruffled, as though nothing unusual had occurred. The tension between them remained palpable, but it was Margaret's quiet calm that dominated the moment. The other passengers, who had been eyeing the situation, returned to their own worlds, but whispers began to circulate, speculating about who Margaret truly was. Some had seen her as just another elderly woman with a cane, while others couldn't help but wonder why someone of her age would be traveling alone, so calmly asserting herself in a first-class line. One passenger, a frequent flyer, muttered to their companion that Margaret's demeanor didn't quite match that of an ordinary passenger. It was as though she had an unspoken authority that the others hadn't picked up on. Unbeknownst to Sarah, the elderly woman she had just slapped was not some unassuming traveler. Margaret King was the chairwoman and founder of the very airline that employed Sarah. In fact, Margaret's legacy and contributions to the airline industry had helped shape it into what it was today. Her personal wealth and influence were only a fraction of her stature in the corporate world. Margaret wasn't just a founder, she was a legend in the business. Her presence in the airport, disguised in a simple navy dress and appearing to be a frail, quiet woman, was intentional. She was known for her discretion and had long avoided drawing attention to her wealth and position. But her presence was anything but ordinary. As Sarah stood there, her mind racing, she could feel the shift in the atmosphere. The air was thicker now, charged with something unseen. She hadn't known it at the time, but Margaret was not just any passenger. This was a woman who could make or break careers with a single phone call. And Sarah had just made the fatal mistake of crossing her. Seconds later, the situation took a turn that Sarah was not prepared for. Margaret's voice cut through the air once more. "I think it's time you learned who I am," she said, her words calm, but there was an unmistakable authority behind them. Her eyes locked with Sarah's, and for the first time, Sarah felt a twinge of real fear. Margaret, still holding her cane with graceful precision, began to walk toward the counter. "You've made quite an impression today, Ms. Brooks," Margaret continued, her tone cool and composed. As Margaret approached the gate agent, the truth began to dawn on Sarah. The realization hit her like a thunderclap: this wasn't just any passenger. This was the Margaret King. The woman who had founded the airline, the very woman whose success had built the empire Sarah worked for. The weight of Margaret's words began to settle in Sarah's mind, and the consequences of her impulsive actions became clear. She had slapped the chairwoman of the airline. The impact of this thought sent a cold shiver down Sarah's spine. The gate agent, recognizing Margaret immediately, stood up in surprise and immediately began speaking to her with great respect, his voice shaking slightly. Sarah, still standing by the first-class line, could do nothing but watch as Margaret calmly explained the situation. The gate agent turned to Sarah, his face a mix of concern and disapproval. He did not need to say anything for Sarah to understand the implications of what she had done. Margaret's voice was clear as she addressed the gate agent. "I'd like to make sure that Ms. Brooks understands the consequences of her actions," she said without a hint of emotion. The gate agent nodded, quickly stepping aside to allow Margaret to take control of the situation. In a soft, but authoritative tone, Margaret continued, "We'll need to conduct a full review of what happened here today. Ms. Brooks, you've made a grave mistake." The room grew still as the weight of Margaret's words settled over everyone present. Passengers who had been passively observing the situation now stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. They could feel the shift in the power dynamics of the airport, and some began to realize that this wasn't just about an elderly woman being mistreated, it was about the very foundation of the airline industry. For Sarah, the moment felt like it stretched into eternity. She had acted without thinking, without knowing who she was truly dealing with. Now, the consequences of her rash decision loomed large, and she realized that her career at the airline was in jeopardy. But Margaret King, as composed as ever, gave no outward sign of triumph or anger. She simply turned back to Sarah, who stood frozen in place, waiting for the inevitable. Margaret was, as always, in control. And for Sarah, this would be the most critical moment of her life, one that would shape the rest of her career, and perhaps, her future. The moment of realization seemed to hang in the air like a thick fog, as Sarah Brooks slowly absorbed the full extent of what she had just done. Margaret King, her cane now firmly in hand, walked calmly to the gate agent, and Sarah stood motionless, staring at the elderly woman. The commotion had died down, but the weight of what had just transpired felt heavier with every passing second. The passengers around them remained silent, many of them now looking at Sarah with a sense of disbelief. Some exchanged whispers, glancing nervously at Margaret, who had, by all accounts, maintained an unshakable composure. No one dared to speak or make any sudden movements, not even the gate agents, who now seemed to be more attentive than ever. Sarah stood frozen, her thoughts racing, her heart pounding in her chest. Margaret King, the woman she had so carelessly slapped, wasn't just any elderly traveler. She was the chairwoman of the airline, the one person who could destroy Sarah's career with a single call. She had unknowingly stepped into the firing line, and now it felt as though her entire career hung in the balance. She watched, helpless, as Margaret calmly spoke to the gate agent, her words measured and professional. "I want to make sure this is properly addressed," Margaret said, her voice soft but with an unmistakable air of authority. The gate agent nodded immediately, his face showing clear signs of nervousness as he fumbled with his paperwork. Sarah swallowed hard, trying to gather her thoughts. Her pulse raced, and she suddenly felt a wave of nausea. How had this happened? One moment, she had been doing her usual job, checking in passengers and ensuring everything ran smoothly, and the next, she had slapped the chairwoman of the airline. As the scene unfolded, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that her world had been turned upside down in an instant. She had been completely unaware of who Margaret was when she dismissed her and, in her frustration, made the rash decision to slap her. Now, the reality was sinking in, she had made the worst mistake of her life. The consequences of that moment were too large to ignore. Her mind raced with the possibilities: termination, a damaged reputation, perhaps even legal ramifications. The pressure of it all began to overwhelm her, and she felt the sting of panic creeping up her spine. Margaret, meanwhile, seemed unfazed by the attention. She simply stood at the counter, waiting for the gate agent to complete the necessary steps. Her voice remained calm and composed, and even though she had been the victim of an unprovoked slap, there was no sign of anger or frustration. Margaret was not one to react impulsively. She was a woman used to being in control, and in this moment, it was clear she had every bit of that control. "I'd like to make sure Ms. Brooks understands the implications of her actions," Margaret continued, her words deliberately calm. "She'll need to understand what it means to treat a passenger with the dignity they deserve." The gate agent, now looking more than a little uncomfortable, nodded again, turning to Sarah, whose eyes had widened in fear. I'm so sorry, Mrs. King," Sarah stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't know, I didn't realize who you were." "I never meant to," Margaret held up a hand, silencing her. "You didn't know. That's not the issue, Ms. Brooks. The issue is that you allowed your frustrations to cloud your judgment and treat a passenger, any passenger, in a manner that is completely unacceptable. And worse, you did it to someone who, by chance, happens to be in a position to ensure that these types of situations don't happen again." The weight of Margaret's words hit Sarah like a ton of bricks. She had been too quick to judge, assuming that the elderly woman didn't belong in the first-class line because of her age and unassuming appearance. She had acted without thinking, and now the consequences were slowly unfolding before her eyes. The more Margaret spoke, the more Sarah realized how much she had taken her position for granted. She had never imagined that such a small, seemingly inconsequential action could spiral into something this serious. The passengers who had been watching from a distance began to whisper amongst themselves, speculating on the fate of the flight attendant. The quiet hum of the airport had returned, but the tension was palpable. Sarah could feel the eyes of every passenger on her, some full of sympathy, others with a quiet sense of judgment. No one knew exactly who Margaret was, but they all seemed to understand that this was no ordinary woman. They knew that Sarah had crossed a line that shouldn't have been crossed. Margaret, still standing with calm authority, turned to the gate agent, who was now hurriedly typing on his computer. "Make sure the proper review process begins immediately," she instructed him. "I'll be in touch with HR, and I'll also be informing the executives about this incident. This cannot go unaddressed." Sarah felt her knees weaken as the implications of Margaret's words settled in. She had no idea what would happen next. Would she be fired on the spot? Would she be reported to higher authorities? Her mind spun with worst-case scenarios. Margaret gave her a final, piercing glance before turning away. "I expect a full report by the end of the day," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. The gate agent, now visibly rattled, nodded hastily as Margaret walked toward the boarding area. Sarah stood there for a long moment, unable to move. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her chest, and her once confident demeanor had evaporated. She had just made the mistake of a lifetime, and now, she had no idea what the future held. All she could do was wait and hope that her fate wouldn't be sealed by this one impulsive action. The events at the airport seemed to have settled into a tense, uncomfortable silence after Margaret King had made it clear that she would be taking the matter to the higher-ups of the airline. Sarah Brooks, standing in the corner, felt her world crumbling around her, but the consequences of her rash decision were just beginning to unfold. The passengers who had witnessed the incident had moved on with their own affairs, but they would never forget what had happened. In fact, for Sarah, the moment of humiliation was just the start of something much bigger, a chain of events she couldn't have predicted. As the hours passed, whispers spread among the airport staff, and soon enough, news of the confrontation began to trickle through the airline's internal communication channels. But it didn't take long for the story to make its way to the outside world. The viral nature of social media, combined with the modern-day thirst for scandal, ensured that the video footage of Sarah slapping Margaret's hand away would quickly gain traction. A few passengers, who had discreetly filmed the incident, uploaded the video online. It wasn't long before the clip made its way across Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, shared by users eager to witness the unfolding drama. The video was short, only a few seconds, but in that brief moment, everything about the situation was clear. It captured Sarah's slap, the immediate aftermath, and Margaret's calm and composed response. What wasn't clear at the time, however, was the identity of the elderly woman. To the online world, the viral video seemed like just another instance of a disgruntled flight attendant clashing with an innocent elderly passenger. The comments flooded in, people discussing the event with a mix of anger, judgment, and curiosity. At first, no one knew Margaret's true identity, but the video was enough to spark outrage across the internet. "What kind of flight attendant treats a passenger like this?" one comment read. "How could anyone slap a sweet old woman like that?" another added. The video quickly garnered thousands of views, with many users speculating about what had transpired. By the time the video reached a wider audience, people had already started creating memes and GIFs, all based around Sarah's actions. They joked about her behavior and criticized the airline for allowing such a thing to happen, but the most shocking part was still to come. The true identity of the elderly woman was slowly starting to surface. It didn't take long before the more tech-savvy users on the internet began to dig deeper. Someone, somewhere, recognized Margaret's calm demeanor and composure. They discovered her name and, shortly thereafter, her position as the chairwoman of the very airline Sarah worked for. The revelation spread like wildfire across the internet. The video, once about a flight attendant slapping an innocent elderly woman, was now about an airline executive, someone with power and influence, being mistreated by an employee. The outrage that had already been building on social media quickly exploded. People started to demand that the airline take immediate action. Fire that flight attendant. How dare she treat someone like that? The chorus of voices grew louder, and it wasn't long before the hashtag #FireSarahBrooks began trending worldwide. The viral video had not only humiliated Sarah, but it had also ignited a firestorm that was now out of her control. The online world, which had initially been fueled by confusion and curiosity, was now united in its condemnation of her actions. Sarah, meanwhile, was still reeling from the events. She had been sent to the back office by her supervisors as the situation was being evaluated. She had expected the worst, but nothing could have prepared her for what was happening on the other side of the office. She had seen the video of the incident, but it hadn't hit her until she checked her social media accounts and saw the comments rolling in, each one more harsh than the last. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, some from family members, others from former colleagues, and still more from people she didn't know. They were all telling her how wrong she had been and asking if she was going to be fired. Within hours, the airline's PR team was working overtime to manage the fallout. Press releases were hastily crafted, and statements were being made about how the airline was investigating the situation. But despite their best efforts, the damage had already been done. The online backlash continued to grow, with petitions being launched to hold Sarah accountable for her actions. It was clear that the airline's reputation was at stake, and it wasn't long before they were forced to make a public statement about the incident. Meanwhile, Margaret King, aware of the viral nature of the video, had not been passive in the fallout. As the chairwoman of the airline, she was no stranger to public scrutiny. But this time, she was the one on the receiving end of a viral moment. However, instead of cowering in the face of criticism, Margaret used her influence to ensure the matter was handled swiftly and effectively. She was resolute in her approach, giving clear instructions to the PR team and legal department to move forward with a formal investigation into Sarah's behavior. As the day wore on, Sarah's fate became increasingly uncertain. She was still employed by the airline, but it seemed like her job was hanging by a thread. She had tried to apologize to her supervisors, to explain that she hadn't known who Margaret was, but the fact remained, she had slapped a senior executive of the airline. The apology, though heartfelt, seemed insufficient in light of the viral attention. There were rumors circulating that the airline was planning to issue a public apology to Margaret, but the fate of Sarah's employment remained unclear. Sarah's world, once centered around her job, had been flipped upside down. She was no longer just a flight attendant, she had become the face of a viral controversy that was spiraling beyond her control. Her social media had been flooded with messages, some supportive, but many critical, and the reality of her situation set in as she sat in the back office, waiting for whatever decision would come next. In the meantime, Margaret had already begun to take steps to ensure that this incident would not be swept under the rug. She was determined to use her platform to make sure that the airline took responsibility for the treatment of its passengers, especially when it came to something as serious as this. As Sarah watched the fallout unfold online, she realized just how far-reaching her actions had been. This was no longer just about a slap, it was about an airline, its executives, and its employees, and Sarah's role in what would be remembered as one of the most public scandals the airline had ever faced. Sarah Brooks sat nervously in the airline's human resources office, her hands trembling slightly as she waited for what felt like the inevitable. The investigation into her conduct was still ongoing, but the whirlwind of media attention and public backlash had made one thing painfully clear: her actions had consequences, and those consequences were now inescapable. The viral video of her slapping Margaret King, the chairwoman of the airline, had spread across social media like wildfire, with the world watching and judging. The hashtag #FireSarahBrooks had trended for days, with thousands of people condemning her for her unprovoked assault on an elderly passenger. Sarah had been called out by family, friends, and colleagues, all asking her how she could have been so reckless. It seemed as though her entire career, not just with the airline, but in the industry as a whole, was on the line. Her phone buzzed incessantly with notifications, and every message, every comment, made her feel smaller. She had spent her days either in isolation at her apartment or in the confines of the HR office, receiving her punishment one piece at a time. Sarah had tried to apologize, she had issued a statement, an open letter, to the public, apologizing for her actions, but it felt hollow. The damage had already been done. The public's judgment was swift, and her attempt at an apology had done little to calm the storm. But what hurt more than anything was the looming presence of Margaret. The woman she had disrespected so severely was not only an important figure in the airline but a woman who could easily end her career with a single phone call. The public might forgive Sarah, after all, she had apologized, hadn't she? But it was Margaret's decision that mattered. Sarah couldn't help but wonder if the apology would even be enough to change Margaret's mind. The door to the HR office opened with a soft click, and Sarah looked up, her breath catching in her throat. It was her supervisor, who had been part of the review process. Behind him stood another figure, Margaret herself, the woman at the center of the controversy, looking as calm and composed as ever. "Sarah, we've been reviewing your situation, and it's clear that the company needs to take action," her supervisor said, his tone professional but laced with a quiet sternness. Sarah nodded, biting her lip, bracing herself for the reprimand. Margaret, standing to the side, observed her with a quiet intensity. She didn't appear angry, but there was no mistaking the disapproval in her gaze. Sarah knew that Margaret, being the chairwoman, had the power to end her career in an instant. The weight of that fact sat heavily on Sarah's chest. She could feel her hands clammy, her heart pounding in her ears. "Sarah," Margaret spoke, her voice smooth and deliberate, "I've read your apology. I've seen the public statements you've made. But I have to ask, would you have apologized if I were just another elderly passenger and not the chairwoman of this airline? Would you have shown the same level of remorse?" Sarah swallowed hard, her throat dry. She felt herself shrink under Margaret's piercing gaze. It was an uncomfortable, penetrating question, one that Sarah didn't know how to answer. Of course, she would like to think that she would have apologized regardless, but in reality, she wasn't sure. She had acted out of frustration, not realizing who Margaret truly was at the time. And now, that mistake was threatening to unravel everything she had worked for. Sarah began, but Margaret raised a hand, cutting her off. "I'm not asking for an explanation, Sarah," Margaret continued, her voice still calm but firm. "I want you to understand something. This isn't just about an apology. This is about how you treat every passenger, regardless of their age, appearance, or status. You must remember that everyone deserves respect, and when you wear this uniform, you represent more than just yourself. You represent this airline." Sarah nodded, the weight of Margaret's words sinking in. She knew she had failed to live up to that expectation. The video of her slapping Margaret's hand was proof of that. But what could she say? The apology felt like a meaningless gesture now. She had been caught up in her own assumptions, her own frustration, and in the process, she had hurt someone who, it turned out, was someone she should have treated with the utmost respect. Margaret's expression softened, just a touch. "I want to give you a chance to make this right. But understand this, you have one chance. If you fail, there will be no going back. You will be dismissed from your position, and you may never work in this industry again. Do you understand?" The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she tried to process Margaret's words. The power that Margaret wielded was overwhelming, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt completely powerless. She had made a mistake, a huge mistake, and now it was up to Margaret to decide her future. "Yes," Sarah finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I understand." Margaret gave a slight nod and turned to her supervisor. "I want Sarah to publicly apologize to all the passengers on this flight. A formal apology, in person. She will explain the mistake she made and take full responsibility. No excuses." Her supervisor nodded in agreement. "We'll arrange that immediately." Sarah's stomach churned. Publicly apologizing was the last thing she wanted to do. But there was no choice, she had to do it. She had to show the airline, the passengers, and most importantly, Margaret, that she had learned from her mistake. If she didn't, her career would be over. Margaret turned to leave, her footsteps echoing in the quiet office. Before she exited, she paused and glanced back at Sarah. "I'm giving you this chance, Sarah. Don't make me regret it." With that, Margaret was gone. Sarah sat in silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. Her life had just been upended, and now, it seemed like the only way forward was to publicly admit her wrongdoing in front of everyone she had wronged. It would be her last chance to prove that she was capable of more than just a single, thoughtless mistake. The days following the incident at the airport dragged on for Sarah Brooks. She had spent the better part of the week dealing with the fallout from the viral video, trying to salvage whatever was left of her reputation and career. Margaret King's decision to give her a chance had come as a surprise, and though Sarah was grateful for the opportunity, she knew that the weight of her mistake could never be erased. The public apology, which had been arranged by her supervisors, was now the most anticipated moment of her career, though, in this case, it would likely define her future. Sarah sat quietly in her office, her hands nervously fidgeting with a pen as she waited for the moment of reckoning. She knew what had to happen, but the thought of standing in front of a room full of passengers and publicly admitting her wrongdoing made her stomach churn. There was no avoiding it now. She had to own up to her mistake, no matter the consequences. Her supervisors had made it clear that this would be her last chance to redeem herself, and she would have to show the passengers, her colleagues, and Margaret King that she understood the gravity of the situation. The public apology was scheduled for the next flight, a short trip that would take her back to her home base. As she arrived at the gate, Sarah's nerves were on edge. The flight was full, and the passengers were already boarding. When it came time for her to speak, she was escorted to the front, where her supervisor stood waiting. The moment she stepped in front of the passengers, all eyes turned to her. "I want to take this opportunity to address something important," Sarah began, her voice shaking slightly at first. She paused, taking a deep breath. "I made a terrible mistake, and I want to apologize to everyone here, especially to Mrs. King, who I wronged." She continued, explaining how her actions had been inappropriate, and how she had failed to treat Margaret with the respect she deserved. As she spoke, Sarah could see the passengers' eyes soften, some nodding in understanding. She was still unsure of what the outcome would be, but she knew she had made the first step toward redemption. As she finished her apology, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. She had owned up to her mistake. Now, all she could do was hope that it would be enough.